Today, we're diving into a fascinating chapter from early American history, taking a closer look at the unique establishment of Georgia, the 13th English colony. Founded in 1732, Georgia's original purpose was as much about defense as it was about settlement. It was strategically positioned as a buffer colony between South Carolina and the Spanish-held Florida, where tensions ran high as the Spanish Empire threatened conflict with the English. One of the remarkable aspects of early Georgia was its initial stance on slavery. Slavery was outright forbidden in the colony. Additionally, we'll explore the interactions between the first settlers and the native Creek Indians, offering insights into the relationships that defined Georgia's beginnings. Today, we'll read the history of Georgia from its earliest settlement to the present time by Timothy Shea Arthur and William Henry Carpenter, published in 1852. As we'll see, Georgia was envisioned as a planned economy, where each man received an equal plot of land and yearly rations. However, as with many planned economies, the colony's production and the overall well-being of its people didn't fully meet expectations. Originally, this region was part of a patent granted to South Carolina, first under proprietary governance, then as a royal colony in 1719, spanning between the 31st and 36th degrees of north latitude. Early discoveries of this territory trace back to Sir Walter Raleigh, inspired by the explorations of his half-brother Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who held a patent from Queen Elizabeth to claim and settle newly found lands. In April 1584, Raleigh dispatched two ships under the command of Captains Amatus and Barlow to explore these territories. Avoiding Gilbert's northern route, Raleigh's expedition took a southern course through the West Indies, finally approaching North America at the Gulf of Florida. The crew followed the coastline, occasionally meeting with Native Americans, until they reached Pamlico Sound in present-day North Carolina. The explorers then continued northward before returning to England in September of that year. Although some historians question whether Raleigh himself ever set foot in North America, there is a fascinating account linked to Georgia's founder, James Edward Oglethorpe. When he arrived from England, Oglethorpe reportedly brought with him Raleigh's journal, suggesting Raleigh may have indeed reached the mouth of the Savannah River and visited the bluff where Savannah was later built. Local Creek Indian stories passed down to Oglethorpe claimed Raleigh was the first Englishman their ancestors had ever seen, leaving such a strong impression that the Creek chief, before his death, requested to be buried atop a high mound near Savannah, where he had conversed with the great and good white stranger. The establishment of a new colony south of the Savannah River became a priority for South Carolina, primarily due to growing tensions between England and Spain over territorial boundaries in North and South America. Spain, already laying claim to Florida through early discovery and settlement, grew increasingly wary of North America's population boom and rising commercial significance. To secure control over both the valuable Indian trade flowing down the Mississippi and the major rivers to the north, Spain fortified its coastlines with troops. This encroachment posed a serious threat to South Carolina, where the economy relied heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans brought in by British merchants to work the rice plantations. Aware of the economic and social vulnerability of this dependency, Spanish authorities sought to exploit it. They encouraged enslaved individuals in South Carolina to seek freedom, offering them refuge and equality as Spanish subjects. In St. Augustine, the Spanish even went so far as to form an entire regiment of former slaves who had escaped from Carolina, fueling tensions despite the absence of formal conflict between the two nations. The lack of clearly defined borders between British-held territories and Spanish Florida only deepened the friction. In an effort to prevent further escapes to St. Augustine, the British constructed a fort on the Altamaha River, manned with garrisons to create a barrier. This action, however, provoked the Spanish governor, who viewed it as an infringement on Spanish territory and protested to the court in Madrid. The Spanish ambassador in London demanded the removal of the troops and the fort's demolition. In response, the British and Spanish governments agreed to have their American governors meet to resolve the boundary disputes amicably. Delegates convened in Charleston, but their negotiations failed to reach a satisfying conclusion. Shortly after, the fort mysteriously burned down, leaving South Carolina's southern border vulnerable once again. With the Spanish authorities in Florida persisting in their territorial advances, South Carolinians grew increasingly alarmed. Seeking a stronger safeguard for their land and livelihoods, they saw the need to establish a more permanent and reliable barrier between themselves and the persistent Spanish presence to the south. With these objectives in mind, advocates promoted the formation of a new colony between the Savannah and Altamaha rivers, persuading influential gentlemen in England to support a compassionate mission, to provide opportunities for impoverished individuals who had no means to sustain themselves or their families in Britain. In June 1732, 21 supporters petitioned the Crown and obtained a charter establishing a separate province from Carolina, officially named Georgia, to honor the king who granted it. Eventually, Georgia's boundaries expanded westward to the Chattahoochee River, which defines much of its border today. Following the charter, the trustees, led by Lord Percival, convened in London to appoint a suitable figure to oversee the new colony and to draft regulations for its governance. To fulfill the charter's charitable intentions, the trustees decided that only those in dire economic conditions, unable to secure a living in England or burdened with large families dependent on parish support, could receive assistance. They excluded those of ill repute, specifically the drunken or vicious. Selected individuals received a set of provisions for their journey and future labor, including essentials like a watchcoat, musket, bayonet, and basic tools for construction and farming, along with an iron pot, pot hooks, and frying pan. Each ward or village had access to a public grindstone. The settlers were also granted a generous year's supply of sustenance: 300 pounds of beef or pork, 114 pounds each of rice, peas, and flour, 44 gallons of strong beer, 64 quarts of molasses, 18 pounds of cheese, 9 pounds of butter, 9 ounces of spices, 9 pounds of sugar, 5 gallons of vinegar, 30 pounds of salt, 12 quarts of lamp oil, and 12 pounds of soap. Similar provisions, minus the beer, were given to women and children over 12, with reduced rations for younger children. Before embarking, each immigrant had to agree to certain commitments. They pledged to board their assigned ship, conduct themselves properly during the voyage, and upon arrival, follow instructions for establishing and managing the colony. For their first 12 months in Georgia, they were expected to work diligently on land clearing, building shelters, and setting up communal defenses, all as directed for the benefit of the colony. After this initial year, they agreed to settle permanently in Georgia, cultivating the land granted to them and their male heirs to the best of their abilities. New settlers would be placed within the colony in designated towns or villages, fostering unity and support among the community. In the towns, each settler received a lot measuring 60 feet by 90 feet for building a house, along with additional farmland in nearby areas, bringing each plot to a total of 50 acres. In the villages, settlers were each granted a 50-acre lot with similar requirements to build a house. A modest rent of 2 shillings and 6 pence sterling was applied to each 50-acre lot, supporting the colony's development. The trustees also allowed each freeholder to bring 1 male servant or apprentice, age 18 or older, for a term of no less than 4 years. To support this, they provided loans covering the passage and initial provisions for each servant, to be repaid by the master within 3 years. Upon completing their term with a certificate of good conduct, servants received a 20-acre plot of land, maintaining the same rent agreements. Georgia's residents were to serve dual roles as both soldiers and farmers. Equipped with arms for defense and tools for farming, they engaged in periodic military drills essential to the colony's security. Settlements were planned with close proximity to towns acting as military garrisons, allowing all residents to reach defensive positions quickly in times of emergency. This strategic layout underscored the trustees' aim to create a colony that was both a protective buffer for the Carolinas and a productive agricultural community. Consequently, land tenures were carefully structured to maintain a balance between farming and defense, with each plot limited to 50 acres, deemed sufficient for family support while also preserving the defensive strength of the colony. Initially, land inheritance was restricted to male heirs, aligning with the founders' goals for the colony's defense. Colonists were supported by public funds for their passage and first year, receiving arms, tools, seeds, and other essentials from the general store. For those who financed their own voyage, grants were provided on similar terms, requiring settlement within a year and the presence of one servant for every 50 acres. Each settler was expected to reside in Georgia for 3 years, clear 1/5 of the land within the first decade, and cultivate an additional 3/5 in the next 10 years. Furthermore, they were to plant 1,000 white mulberry trees for every 100 acres cleared, supporting the colony's ambitions to develop a silk industry. A unique restriction applied to all colonists: the exclusion of black individuals within Georgia's borders, except by explicit permission from the trustees. This policy aimed to establish a European-only military frontier, safeguarding South Carolina's enslaved population from potential Spanish influence and eliminating incentives for idleness, often linked to the presence of enslaved labor. This decision reflected the founders' intent to foster a hard-working and self-reliant population, aligned with the colony's broader defensive and economic objectives. Some argued that introducing enslaved individuals into Georgia would backfire, making it easier for South Carolina's enslaved people to escape and strengthening the Spanish forces at St. Augustine rather than creating the defensive buffer intended. Committed to this vision, the trustees, after substantial personal contributions, began soliciting donations from others. These funds went towards clothing, arming, purchasing farming tools, and arranging passage for the impoverished who were willing to embark on this new endeavor. With sufficient funds gathered through trustee contributions and private donations, it was decided to send 114 individuals, men, women, and children, all struggling financially in England, to begin the settlement. James Edward Oglethorpe, a trustee himself, volunteered to accompany the group at his own expense, ensuring the colony's foundations would be laid with strong leadership. The trustees organized a structure of governance according to their charter's powers. Once the preparations were complete, Reverend Mr. Schubert of the Church of England, a silk instructor from Piedmont, and 114 settlers boarded the ship and under Captain Thomas. Supported with all necessary supplies and facing only the uncertainties of sea travel and a new environment, they set sail. Arriving in Charleston on January 13, 1733, with the unfortunate loss of only 2 children, the settlers received warm hospitality from the governor and council. Generous provisions and livestock were provided by the Carolinians. Charleston authorities also sent scout boats and a detachment of rangers to accompany the settlers to Georgia, offering protection from potential Native American attacks as the settlers constructed their homes and fortifications. The group reached Beaufort on January 20th, where Oglethorpe left the settlers temporarily while he scouted the region with 2 experienced guides from Carolina in search of an ideal location. They selected a bluff along the Savannah River, where a small fort was soon built, complete with mounted guns for defense. Settlers began felling trees and constructing huts under Oglethorpe's energetic leadership. He organized them into a militia, appointed officers, and provided arms and ammunition. Regular military drills, even in the presence of native tribes, showcased the settlers' readiness. Thanks to prior training from the London Guards, they demonstrated discipline nearly on par with regular soldiers. With the colony now settled and fortified, Oglethorpe's next objective was to negotiate with the local Native Americans for land. The primary tribes occupying the region were the Upper and Lower Creeks. The Upper Creeks remained numerous and strong, while the Lower Creeks had been weakened by war and disease, with a total combined population estimated around 25,000. Given their claim to the lands southwest of the Savannah River, securing Creek alliance was crucial for the colony's future. Only a small band of natives inhabited Yamakra, the Creek name for the bluff Oglethorpe had chosen for his settlement, making it an opportune site to begin Georgia's new chapter. Recognizing the importance of securing an alliance with the Upper Creeks, who were larger in number, Oglethorpe decided to reach out to them to join in a treaty. For this delicate task, he enlisted Mary Musgrove, a half-Creek woman married to a Carolina trader. Fluent in both English and Creek, and influential among her people, Mary was well suited to bridge the gap. Oglethorpe won her loyalty with gifts and a yearly salary of £100. With her help, he summoned the leading men of the Creek nation to Savannah, where about 50 chiefs gathered. Here, Oglethorpe successfully concluded a treaty, cemented by the customary exchange of gifts. In a moving gesture, Tomo Chichi, a prominent Creek leader and speaker, presented Oglethorpe with a buffalo skin lined with eagle feathers. "I give you this," he declared, "because the eagle represents speed and the buffalo strength. The English, like the eagle, have flown over vast seas, and like the buffalo, they are strong and resilient. The feathers signify love, while the buffalo's warmth represents protection. May the English protect and cherish our families as we look to this alliance." The treaty, pending approval from trustees in England, secured a peaceful agreement that filled both sides with hope for future prosperity. Under the treaty, the trustees received full rights to all lands between the Savannah and Altamaha rivers, extending west to the tide water's edge and encompassing coastal islands from Tybee to St. Simons. However, the agreement allowed the Creeks to retain Sapelo and St. Catherine's Islands for hunting and fishing, as well as a tract of land from Pipemaker's Bluff to Apalachicola Creek, which they used as a camp when visiting Savannah. Though the arrangement seemed favorable, these reserved areas would later lead to significant challenges, as later events would reveal. In June 1734, the trustees reported to the Lord Chancellor, announcing that they had successfully transported 152 settlers to Georgia at the corporation's expense, 61 of whom were men capable of bearing arms. Financial support from private donors reached nearly £4,000, of which over half was spent on the settlement's development. Meanwhile, the colonists busied themselves with various projects. They established a public garden as a nursery on the town's eastern side, planting mulberry trees, vines, oranges, and olives to sustain the population. A beacon was constructed on Tybee Island at the river's mouth, and Fort Argyle was built at the narrowest point of the Ogeechee River to guard against potential inland attacks from St. Augustine. Additionally, a stockade fort was erected at Skidaway Narrows, fortifying the settlement's defenses. To further bolster Georgia's rapid development, the British government sold some land on St. Christopher, allocating £10,000 from the proceeds to support the new colony. In the fall of 1733, the trustees arranged for the arrival of two groups, totaling 341 settlers, mainly persecuted Protestants from Salzburg, Germany. These settlers established themselves farther up the Savannah River, naming their new home Ebenezer, a settlement soon joined by other fellow countrymen. That year, glowing reports from Georgia's settlers reached England, sharing tales of the promising climate and thriving conditions, creating a surge of interest and optimism about life in the colony. Around this time, a pamphlet titled A New and Accurate Account of the Provinces of Carolina and Georgia circulated in London. The writer praised the trustees and described Georgia's climate as healthy, serene, and pleasant, rarely subject to extreme temperatures or rapid weather changes. Winters were noted as brief and mild, while summers were cooled by refreshing breezes, lacking the harsh northwest winds of Virginia or the searing heat felt in Spain, Italy, and Egypt. According to this account, Georgia's soil was incredibly fertile, producing abundant crops with minimal cultivation. Grains reportedly yielded up to 100-fold, despite what the writer described as mere scratching of the earth to cover the seed. Livestock and poultry multiplied freely, virtually eliminating their cost, and vineyards grew naturally. The forests near Savannah were described as easily cleared, with trees standing sparsely, often without undergrowth. For those cutting timber, the roots were said to decay within 4 or 5 years, allowing grazing in the meantime. Felling trees for tar or other uses was straightforward. A few axe strokes around the base weakened them, and within a year or two, a strong gust could bring down vast areas in minutes. According to the pamphlet, Georgia's natural resources and climate were nearly impossible to exaggerate, invoking poet Edmund Waller's verse on the Carolinian region as a fitting tribute to this idyllic land. The pamphlet continued its poetic praise of Georgia with lines by Edmund Waller, describing a paradise untouched by hardship. The spring which but salutes us here / inhabits there and courts them all the year. / ripe fruits and blossoms on the same tree / live at once. They promise what at once they give. / so sweet the air, so moderate the clime. / none sickly lives or dies before his time. / heaven sure has kept a spot of earth uncursed / to show how all things were created first. The author further noted that Native Americans would travel long distances to bring game to settlers, selling an entire deer for 6 pence and a 40-pound wild turkey for tuppence. This glowing description captivated England's rural population, who envisioned Georgia as an earthly paradise. Yet, to temper expectations, the trustees clarified that the pamphlet's description was somewhat exaggerated. With the settlers' needs secured, Oglethorpe sailed for England in April 1734, bringing with him the Creek chief Tomochichi, his wife, and several other influential Creek leaders. When they arrived in London, Tomochichi was introduced to the king and addressed him with awe and reverence, saying, "This day I see the majesty of your face, the greatness of your house, and the number of your people. I come in my old days, though I expect no personal gain. I come for the good of the children of all the nations of the upper and lower creeks, so that they may learn the English language. These feathers of the eagle, swiftest of birds, fly around our nations as emblems of peace, traveling from town to town. We bring them to you, O great king, as a token of everlasting peace. Whatever words you say to me, I will faithfully relay to all the Creek chiefs." The king warmly replied, "I am pleased to assure you of my goodwill towards the people from whom you have come. I am deeply grateful for this gift, a sign of their peaceful intentions towards me and my people. I look forward to maintaining a good relationship with the Creeks, and I am eager to show you signs of my particular friendship." While the Creek leaders were in England, nothing was spared to display Britain's wealth and power. The government provided a weekly allowance of £20, and the nobility hosted magnificent feasts in their honor. When they returned to Georgia 4 months later, they carried with them gifts valued at £400, and they left with a high impression of English hospitality and strength, pledging their enduring loyalty. Upon his return, Tomochichi shared his experience with his people, expressing that while the English possessed great wisdom, power, and wealth, the Native Americans had vast lands but lacked resources. He encouraged the Creeks to allow the English to settle on unused lands, promising that these settlers would bring useful goods for cultivation and trade. Tomochichi assured them that the English would be fair in trade, that they were friends and allies, and would stand alongside the Creeks in times of conflict. Despite the enthusiastic praises of some colonists for Georgia's climate, fertility, health, and the almost Arcadian life of the people who had immigrated there, it soon became clear that Georgia was not as healthy and productive as had been imagined. In part because of Oglethorpe's absence, the colonists were neither happy nor prosperous. When the governor sailed for England in April 1734, he delegated his authority mainly to a man named Thomas Costin. Other officials were also connected with him, but since Costin was solely responsible for the management of the public supplies, they depended on him for their livelihood and were therefore entirely under his control. This man of low status soon became intoxicated with the power he was given. 28:16, he became arrogant, haughty, and brutal, becoming a kind of governor, ordering the officials and 8 landowners to stand at the entrance to the courthouse with rifles and bayonets during the session, and to turn off their rifles as soon as he appeared. He harassed the jury members and threatened with imprisonment, the pillory, and the siege to any who dared to oppose his arbitrary actions. Among the victims of this tyranny was Captain Joseph Watson. Costin sued the militia officer for inciting hostility in the minds of the Indians. Watson was indicted, and Costin appeared against him in the triple role of witness, prosecutor, and judge. The jury returned twice without finding the defendant guilty of any crime, except for certain careless use of language. Costin reconvened the jury, recommended that they find him guilty by reason of insanity, and commit the matter to the court. This they did. Costin immediately ordered him to prison, imprisoning him for 3 years without sentence. In December 1734, Mr. Gordon was sent by the trustees as chief superintendent, but old Costin's cunning soon found a way to remove his opponent. Gordon was refused money or provisions from the treasury, and this refusal made it impossible for him to support himself and his family, and he was forced to return to England after a stay of 6 weeks. After Gordon's resignation, 2 more were appointed, but the first died soon afterwards, and the second soon became such an obedient instrument in Costin's hands that the latter eventually restored his authority, which remained as unlimited as before. But the colony was no longer prosperous, and the set of rules drawn up by the trustees was hardly adapted to the circumstances and conditions of the poor colonists. Most of the people were idlers or outcasts at home, and it was impossible to transform them into industrious farmers abroad. The lease terms under which they held their land offered no incentive to make extraordinary efforts. With no male heirs, the land reverted to trusteeship upon the death of the owner. While the restrictions on the Indian trade hurt Georgia, they benefited the Carolinas, where trade could take place without restrictions. In the Carolinas, too, people could buy as many slaves as they wanted, and in exchange for full ownership, they could own hundreds of acres of land and pick the best ones for free. Comparing the two conditions in the neighboring states, the Georgians soon became dissatisfied, and many of them crossed the Savannah River to acquire land under the auspices of the more favorable Carolina. By 1735, the British government, considering their rapid population growth essential for other colonies, allocated large sums of money to the settlement of Georgia. Thus their efforts became more vigorous. As the poor classes of people who had been the first settlers proved to be as lazy and useless abroad as they had been before at home, the trustees now sought a hardy, brave, and industrious race accustomed to country employment, and turned to her. They settled on the Alamataha River, built a city there, and called it New Inverness. She is now known as Darien. At about the same time, 170 Germans embarked at Oglethorpe and joined their countrymen at Ebenezer. 31:54, within 3 years Georgia had grown to 600 inhabitants, 1/3 of them German. Oglethorpe arrived in Georgia on February 5, 1736, carrying a large number of guns for the forts and batteries already built or to be built in Savannah, Frederica, Augusta, and other places. The city of Augusta, which was now to be occupied, had been settled and partially settled the previous year. Several warehouses had already been built and contained goods suitable for the Indian trade. A boat built by local residents and designed to carry about 10,000 pounds of furs made 4 or 5 round trips a year to Charleston. Augusta quickly became a popular spring break location for Native American traders, who bought nearly 2,000 pack horses and furs there each year. It is estimated that 600 white people were involved in the trade. The famous John Wesley accompanied Oglethorpe to Georgia, intending to act as a missionary to the Indians and preach to the settlers. Before leaving England, Wesley and his followers were distinguished by their unusually religious life. They received the sacrament of the gospel. Wesley quickly won a number of converts, but in doing so, he had the misfortune of creating an unpleasant division among the people. His enemies accused him of demanding too much of his converts' time to attend prayer meetings and sermons, which were held at odd hours, and which seriously hindered their industrial activities. 33:42 other, more serious charges were made, but we can rightly conclude, in view of his subsequent impeccable life, that they were either false or greatly exaggerated. Finding himself implicated by the malice of ill-wishers and in the face of humiliating hardships, he abruptly left the province and never returned. So that is the content of this episode about the first colonization of the British colony of Georgia. It was the last of the original 13 colonies to be settled by the British in 1732 and the first to explicitly prohibit slavery, although this would change, as we shall see in later episodes of this series. The book was written by 2 authors, Timothy Arthur and William Carpenter. I can't find much information about William Carpenter, but Timothy Arthur was a fairly well-known author who was in the same literary circles as Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote a number of novels, as well as a number of state histories with William Carpenter. In addition to Georgia, he wrote histories of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, Kentucky, New Jersey, Illinois, and Vermont. The book doesn't go into much detail about why John Wesley left the colony so abruptly. So in an upcoming episode on this channel, we'll read an account of his time in Georgia and how things turned out for him and his ministry. His troubles seem to have started when he became interested in a young woman who was related to Thomas Costin, a merchant and de facto ruler of Savannah. Perhaps an episode of this channel will be dedicated to Thomas Costin. Some historians have argued that Costin is portrayed in a bad light and was not actually the evil tyrant that this book and others claim. The channel is called Unworthy History because we cover true stories that have been pushed aside and deemed unworthy of being aired on television history. Channels. You want to see more episodes like this? Then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.